A room filled with people, some sitting, some standing, all talking over each other. In the middle of it, a man raises his arm. At first glance, it might look like nothing, just a stretch, or maybe a wave. But then you notice the way his hand is angled, stiff, and deliberate. The room goes quiet for a second, and in that silence, you can almost hear the weight of what just happened. That man is Steve Bannon, and this moment would soon explode into headlines around the world. Steve Bannon wasn't always the center of political storms. He started as a guy working on Wall Street, climbing the ladder at Goldman Sachs, but he didn't stay there. Over time, he became a name tied to big ideas, some inspiring to his supporters, others alarming to his critics. By 2016, he was one of the masterminds behind Donald Trump's presidential campaign, helping shape the message that won Trump the White House. Later, he even had a seat at the table as Trump's chief strategist. But with every step forward, controversy followed. Him like a shadow. People either saw him as a bold thinker fighting for change or as someone pushing dangerous extremes. Then came the accusation that changed everything. Reports surfaced claiming Bannon had raised his arm in what looked like a Nazi salute during a private meeting. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Headlines popped up everywhere calling him out and demanding answers. For many, this wasn't just about one gesture. It was about what it represented. Bannon had already been vocal about nationalism and immigration, topics that stir strong emotions. Accusing him of something linked to hate groups from history hit like a punch to the gut for some, while others rushed to defend him, saying it was all a misunderstanding. Either way, the stakes were high. This wasn't just another scandal. It was a moment that could define how people saw him, and the movement he stood for forever. The room where it all happened was dimly lit, with the hum of murmured conversations filling the air. It wasn't a big space, just a handful of people sitting around a long table, some leaning back in their chairs, others scribbling notes. The walls were bare except for a whiteboard covered in messy writing. Words like strategy, movement, and resistance stood out. This wasn't your typical meeting. It was a gathering of far-right activists, people who admired Steve Bannon's ideas and saw him as a leader. At one point, someone said something that got a laugh from the group. That's when it happened. According to some in the room, Bannon raised his arm, not casually, but in a way that looked sharp, deliberate. One attendee later described it as unmistakable, while another shrugged it off, saying he was just stretching or joking around. But not everyone was laughing. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. By the time the meeting ended, no one could have guessed how much that moment would blow up. Once word got out, the reaction was explosive. Critics didn't hold back. They called Bannon a symbol of hate, accusing him of aligning himself with ideologies most people thought were buried in history books. News outlets ran stories with bold headlines, and late-night comedians turned the incident into jokes. On social media, hashtags like Ban Bannon started trending, with thousands of posts calling for consequences. But on the other side, Bannon's supporters pushed back hard. They accused the media of twisting things, saying this was just another attempt to smear him. "It's not what it looks like," one supporter tweeted. "They're trying to cancel him because they're scared of his ideas." The internet became a battleground, with arguments raging in comment sections and forums. Some even shared memes mocking the accusations, while others posted fiery rants defending Bannon's legacy. Amid all the noise, there was one voice that cut through. The voice of a Holocaust survivor named Rachel. She didn't post angry tweets or write op-eds, but when she spoke, people listened. In an interview, she talked about how seeing images of Bannon's alleged gesture brought back painful memories. "I lost family because of that symbol," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she held a photo of her grandparents. "It's not just an arm raised in the air. It's a reminder of everything we've tried to leave behind." Her words carried weight because they came from a place of lived experience. For her, this wasn't about politics or opinions. It was personal. And for many watching, her pain made the issue feel more real, more urgent. It wasn't just about whether Bannon meant to do it or not. It was about what it meant for someone like Rachel to see that gesture resurface in today's world. To understand why the accusation against Steve Bannon hit so hard, you have to look at the things he's said and done over the years. Bannon has always been clear about what he believes in: economic nationalism, which means putting your own country's needs first, even if it means stepping on toes internationally. He's talked a lot about how globalism, or the idea of countries working closely together, weakens nations. For him, it's about protecting jobs, culture, and borders. But not everyone sees it that way. Critics say his words often sound harsh, especially when he talks about immigration. He's made comments linking immigrants to crime, which many people find unfair and divisive. To his supporters, he's just telling it like it is. But to others, his language feels like it fuels fear and anger. Over time, these kinds of statements have painted him as someone who walks a fine line between bold ideas and dangerous rhetoric. Then there's the gesture itself, the Nazi salute. It didn't start out as some random movement. It was tied to one of the darkest periods in history. Back in the 1930s and 40s, Adolf Hitler and his followers used it as a symbol of loyalty to their hateful ideology. Even today, decades later, raising your arm like that carries the same weight it did back then. It's not just an old-fashioned sign, it's a reminder of hatred, violence, and suffering. That's why it's still taboo worldwide. When someone does it intentionally or not, it stirs up strong feelings because it drags the past into the present. And this isn't the first time something like this has caused trouble. Remember when a politician in Europe was caught doing something similar? Or when a celebrity got slammed for using the gesture as a joke? Each time, the backlash was huge because people don't see it as harmless. The question now is whether Bannon's alleged salute fits into this pattern, or if it really was just a misunderstanding. Of course, opinions are split. Some experts argue that Bannon's history shows he's playing with fire. Historians point out that his ties to far-right groups and his focus on nationalism echo ideas from the past that led to real harm. Ethicists say symbols matter, and leaders, like Bannon, have a responsibility to avoid anything that could be seen as endorsing hate. On the other hand, some political analysts believe Bannon gets unfairly targeted because of his outspoken style. They argue he's not promoting extremism. He's just challenging the status quo in ways that make people uncomfortable. One analyst put it this way: Bannon's problem isn't what he believes, it's how people interpret his actions. Whether you think he crossed a line or got misunderstood depends on where you stand. But one thing is clear: the debate around him isn't going away anytime soon. The accusations didn't just stay in the headlines, they hit Steve Bannon where it hurt. Speaking gigs he once relied on for income started drying up. Event organizers canceled appearances, saying they didn't want the backlash that came with having him around. Even some of his closest allies seemed to take a step back, at least publicly. People who used to praise him began avoiding his name altogether. It wasn't just about losing opportunities, though. The scrutiny from law enforcement ramped up too. Investigators dug into his past actions, looking for anything else they could pin on him. For someone who thrived in the spotlight, being pushed to the sidelines felt like a heavy blow. Friends mentioned how stressed he seemed during this time, constantly checking his phone and reading news updates. It was clear he wasn't just dealing with professional fallout, it was personal too. The ripple effect spread far beyond Bannon himself. Within conservative circles, opinions were all over the place. Some figures tried to distance themselves, worried about being linked to the controversy. A few even made public statements condemning the alleged gesture as if to say, "We're not like that." But others doubled down, standing by Bannon no matter what. They argued that the accusations were blown out of proportion and that the media was targeting him because of his influence. This divide created tension among groups that usually stuck together. And it wasn't just about Bannon. It also changed how people saw the Trump-era policies and figures tied to them. Critics used the moment to argue that these leaders promoted harmful ideas, while supporters said it was proof of how unfairly their side was treated. Either way, the incident became another chapter in the ongoing story of polarization in politics. As for legal consequences, things got messy but never fully stuck. There were whispers of investigations, with lawyers poring over evidence to see if charges could be filed. Lawmakers debated whether an action like this could count as hate speech or incitement, but in the end, nothing concrete came of it. No, charges were brought forward, and the case quietly faded from courtrooms. Still, the lack of legal action didn't mean the issue disappeared. If anything, it kept the focus on public opinion rather than official punishment. For Bannon, this meant walking a tightrope, trying to rebuild trust with some while shrugging off criticism from others. The whole situation left more questions than answers. Was justice served? Or was this just another example of how hard it is to hold powerful people accountable? When the accusations came knocking, Steve Bannon didn't stay silent for long. He stepped forward to address the storm head-on, though his response left people divided. In interviews and press conferences, he denied that the gesture was what it looked like. It wasn't a Nazi salute, he insisted, claiming it was either a joke or simply misinterpreted. Some of his supporters latched onto this explanation, saying it proved how unfairly he'd been treated. Others weren't convinced. They pointed out that even if it wasn't intentional, the fact that it could be seen that way showed poor judgment. For those watching closely, his tone mattered as much as his words. Was he genuinely trying to clear things up, or was he just managing damage control? It was hard to tell. Either way, his defense became a big part of the conversation. Over time, public opinion started to shift, but not in one clear direction. For some people, the scandal cemented their view of Bannon as someone who thrived on controversy and divisive ideas. They saw the accusations as proof that he was more trouble than he was worth. But others began to soften their stance, especially after the initial wave of outrage died down. A few even argued that focusing so much on one gesture distracted from bigger issues. Polls and surveys showed mixed results, with opinions often split along political lines. What was clear, though, was that the incident stuck to him like glue. Even months later, any mention of his name still brought up the same old debate. Whether people forgave him or wrote him off depended largely on where they stood before the accusations ever surfaced. In the end, Bannon seemed to realize he needed to do something to mend fences. He made a point of visiting Holocaust memorials and meeting with Jewish leaders, gestures that some saw as genuine attempts at reconciliation. Photos of him standing quietly at these sites circulated online, sparking new rounds of discussion. Critics dismissed the moves as too little, too late, just PR stunts to clean up his image. But there were also voices who said it was a step in the right direction, even if it didn't erase everything that had happened. The reception was mixed, but one thing was certain. These actions kept him in the spotlight, for better or worse. Redemption, it seemed, wasn't going to come easy, or quickly. Symbols have a way of sticking around longer than the moments that create them. A single gesture can tell a story, whether it's meant to or not. For Steve Bannon, one raised arm became a flashpoint, a symbol that overshadowed everything else he'd done. But does that one moment define him forever? Or should we look at the bigger picture of who someone is and what they stand for? It's not an easy question to answer. Intent matters, but so does how people interpret things. Sometimes, even if you didn't mean harm, the impact can still cut deep. That's the tricky thing about symbols. They carry weight beyond what we might intend. So where does that leave us? Maybe it's worth thinking about our own biases. Do we jump to conclusions too quickly, or do we give people room to explain themselves? And when it comes to leaders, how much responsibility should they take for the messages their actions send? These aren't just questions about Steve Bannon. They're questions about all of us. What will your gesture say? Start the conversation today. Hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. Together, let's keep asking the hard questions and sharing the stories that matter. Click the bell icon to get notified every time we post a new video. Your support helps us bring more thought-provoking content to life. Thank you for being part of this community.